Here's our top 10 wishes and wants for the upcoming DLC for Elden Ring. Number 10, mounts. This is probably our favorite wish, but also the least likely to be added. A simple addition to the game would be to make Torrent customizable, but instead we would love to see different options for mounts with different niche abilities. For example, rune bears have increased health, poise, and defense, but they can't double jump. An undead horse ridden by the Albonarix in the game, they'd have lower health, but don't require a Crimson Flask to resummon. A Knight's Cavalry mount that changes the attack UI and could possibly sync up with the armor. In the lore, Knight's Cavalry mounts are shrouded, which could increase a stealth aspect to the mount. Either an Albonaric wolf or Loretta's horse could increase archery and spellcasting. The Traveling Merchant's mule could increase item discovery and rune acquisition in mounted combat, but it adds madness buildup while mounted after each kill. And lastly, Tree Sentinel mounts. The standard Tree Sentinel allowing your double jump button to function as a ground slam, just like the Tree Sentinels, and the Draconic mount, which shoots a fireball instead of a jump. Each mount would have unique pros and cons, allowing for more customization, especially if they allowed mounted combat in PvP. What other mounts would you like to see, and what do you think their abilities should be? Number 9, useful abilities, such as speed boosts, double jumps without mounts, and integrations with summons. These are essentially spells or incantations that would be helpful for speeding up gameplay, making gameplay more convenient, more efficient. I think that a speed boost would be a really nice spell because it would allow you to progress through the game much faster in areas where you're not allowed to mount. It would also allow you to quickly get away from an enemy if you are a caster or an archer. Something that the community has pointed out several times at this point is the weakness of faith incantations. While faith incantations are some of the most fun things to use in the game, ultimately almost every single boss in the game is actually very resistant, leading it to really only be effective in open world gameplay, and then when you finally come to the boss, you're pathetic. This is something we'd really like to see changed because I'd really love to use some of these faith incantations on bosses and actually have it do something. Increasing the use of bow builds. Right now they have a lot of really cool and interesting bows in the game, both crossbows, great bows, regular bows, and the jar cannon of course, but ultimately they're not very useful for gameplay. It's kind of something that you just toggle to really quick to use, but then you're going to switch back immediately to your other weapon. Right now I really only use a bow to rune farm, and that's kind of a shame. Extra graces. Right now there's a lot of places in Elden Ring that are lacking with a convenient checkpoint. A couple of places we can think of are the Gowry Shack in Caelid, the Warjar Arsenal, every Coliseum, Placidusax's Arena, and the place where Blackguard is cooking crabs in the Altus Plateau. Another spell that I thought of that could be really fun to mess with while creating this video was an Undead Revive. This could be used essentially as the last stand spell, where if you receive a death blow, you'll get one chance to revive as long as the enemy doesn't hit your reviving corpse, and you get one more chance to keep playing. What are some other spells or abilities that you think could be really useful? Number 8, PvP incentive. As of right now, there's no real reward to play PvP other than the experience of battling someone. It would be more engaging if after you win, you could receive runes, an armor or weapon set related to the lore of the invasions. Since battles are location specific, maybe we could win a spirit summons related to the area we're fighting in. This would make the battles more fun, but it would also increase PvP engagement in general. It would also be very cool to get a review of the match. Personally, I would like to see how well I did in the battle and where I could improve. Mounted combat is a unique addition to Elden Ring and would fit well in PvP. Just like how each arena now has its niche, larger maps could be included to accompany a mounted combat scenario. Renala's Moon Map and Placidusax's Arena are a couple that we think of that could work well. If you have more ideas of maps that would work well with mounted combat, drop a comment down below. Number 7, a New Game Plus. Right now, New Game Plus is starting to feel a little bit stale. It's still really fun to play, but ultimately the bosses are just getting a little more challenging, but they're scaling with how strong we're becoming as characters. And this just leads to basically repeating the same game over and over again with not much difference. One aspect of gameplay that could make this more interesting is if they made the open world more challenging. Imagine stumbling upon a fire monk camp, right? But there's 3 times as many fire monks as there were previously, and they're more damage buffed, they're more defense buffed, and maybe the base is even changed. This would give you more incentive to continue exploring the open map instead of just running through the game, going to boss after boss, and then starting New Game Plus 10 or whatever you're on. Creating different camps and mini armies all over the open world as long as it provides as many runes as you would receive from killing a boss, would allow so much extra gameplay and so much more exploration, even into corners of the map that you've already explored. This would also encourage new styles of builds, because instead of optimizing your build just for the boss, you could create a build that was more centered around taking on several enemies at the same time from different angles. And finally, we think that New Game Plus should be infinite scaling, because right now it seems to be that the scaling stops at around New Game 7 to 10, somewhere around there. What we'd really like to see instead is every New Game Plus have an increase of a set percentage. For instance, maybe every New Game Plus receives a 25% buff in intensity. That way, this would really encourage people to continue playing. It would get to a point where the game is exponentially increasing in difficulty, but the player is maxed out. Number 6, character customization. So at this moment, there's really not much of a point to customizing your character, because really the most impactful character customization is your weight and your size, because that changes the size of the armor. What I would really like to see is a show or hide helm function. To go a step further, I would really like to see armor skins and customizable color palettes that would be available in the alter garments section. At this point, alter garments literally is just removing or adding a cape. I would at least like to see that expanded on. As of right now, the character customization is very extensive, but it kind of leaves you high and dry, because at the end of the day, you're just going to cover all of the customization you just did with armor and look like everybody else. Number 5, scaling your summons. While not everybody uses summons, and some people view summons as a cheap way to play the game, I've found summons as one of the most useful things that you can have while soloing the game. But I think it's pretty clear which summons are useful and which summons are not. Tish and the Mimic tier are really the only useful ones, and honestly, the Mimic tier is so much better than Tish. The Mimic tier is entirely customizable. The Mimic tier has your talismans, has your armor, has your weapons, has your incantations, and this is actually really unfortunate, because the gameplay would be so much more interesting if certain summons were more useful for certain bosses or situations and vice versa. What we'd really love to see is buffing and boosting the other summons in more different and interesting ways. For example, imagine summoning the Perfumer, and while the Perfumer does buff you in defense and give you some healing properties, imagine if it also increased the damage dealt from your perfumes that you cast. Or if you summoned a Clean Rot Knight and your holy damage was increased. Going even further, it could be interesting to reward the player with certain items or spells based on the summons they use for the battle, as long as it relates back to the lore. But since none of this is the case and Mimic tier is still the GOAT, I really just haven't bothered to collect any Glovewort after maxing out the Mimic tier, and I haven't talked to Rodrika since I started the game. So, number 4, missing content. This includes cut content and expanding what feels like incomplete builds. There's been a lot of teaser items, spells, and other things that were cut from the OG game but found in the game files. Not only are these items generally exciting to see, but they are assets that are already created, making it much simpler to just plug back into the game. Many fantasy builds sound really exciting in the game, especially when you find a cool item or a spell, but they fall short once you realize how scarce the assets actually are. Some examples would be the Briar build or the Fundamentalist spells. We think that there will be more items added regardless, but specifically finishing the assets for these builds would give the players the fulfillment of something that they've already been hoping for. What is a build in the game right now that you feel like is incomplete? Number 3, UI changes. These are just simple tweaks and bugs in the game that we've noticed that would make gameplay just all around a lot more enjoyable. The first one is the lock on to targets. Lock on is really great in Elden Ring, but it becomes really frustrating when your target moves behind something just for a second and then the lock is gone. The best example of this is when you're battling Malekith and he dives behind one of the pillars just for a second and then your lock on is gone. Scaling of talismans. I think it's no secret that there's several talismans in this game that provide a minuscule benefit at best and a waste of a talisman slot at worst. We would really like to see the minuscule talismans scaled up to the useful talismans instead of just nerfing the useful talismans. This would provide just way more fun and way more options for niche builds. Like an example is the Radigan's icon, which increases the speed that you cast spells at like 1/8 of a second. Ultimately, I'm just gonna pick something else. Also, that talisman just looks awkward. Like, he has pecs, but they seem to also just be his abs, and it just looks weird. Detailed explanations for items. Right now, a lot of the items kind of tell you what they do, but it's really not that clear how effective they are. A lot of items say, for example, they temporarily boost attack, but they don't provide exactly how long they boost attack or what percentage they boost the attack with. And as a result, most of us are just looking it up on Elden Wiki anyway, and then going off of that information. It would just save a lot of trips to Google if they provided the exact time frame that the item is useful for and the exact amount of buffing it provides. Pointless items. Now, I know a lot of people are going to argue that every item is a point, and I'm sure that Rainbow Stone has helped you in some way, but the fact is 90% of items I don't use ever. It would be really cool to see some of these items provide some sort of scaling property, or just don't have them in the game. Like, you don't have to have this many useless items in the game. Increasing the resale value of items. Right now, most items just don't sell for very much at all. They're barely worth reselling in your first playthrough of Elden Ring, and especially in New Game Plus 5, 6, 7, 8, 1,000 runes for a sword is really not helping you at all. It seems that on average, most things sell for roughly 100 to 1,000 runes, which is less than the average golden rune you find, and less than the average moderate enemy that you kill. And lastly, favorited items. Once you get to about your second or third playthrough, you're gonna start to see your inventory just get way too full of way too many things. And because the resale value is so low, it's not even really worth it to keep collecting all of these things. Therefore, it would be really nice to have a favorite slot for armor, weapons, spells, and useful items. This would also be really helpful for mid-battle sequences when you need to swap out items, armor, or talismans. Number 2, fixing multiplayer UI. A summary of what we want can be listed on the #1 downloaded Elden Ring mod on Nexus, which has 4 times more downloads than the second most popular mod, link in the bio. We pretty much agree with everything they've changed in that mod, including allowing up to 5 players in multiplayer, allowing mounts, open world exploration, game progression, events completed in online play also progress in the game of your own world, and problems with scaling. Currently, I feel like a god when playing by myself, but I feel like a wet towel playing with my friend who is 3 levels below me. I understand why there would be scaling for a large difference in levels, but I don't think there really should be any scaling with a 10 level difference when it comes to bosses. And number 1, armor. This is something that they're obviously going to add in the new DLC, but the reason we're mentioning it here is we would like the armor that already exists in the game to be a little more buffed, useful, and versatile. Right now, most of the armor sets don't actually provide that much value to you other than defense capabilities. In fact, mostly it's just the helm that provides any sort of benefit. And the problem with this too is unless you use the full armor set, you kind of look ridiculous. We'd really love to see an Ash of War system in place for armor in the same way that it is for weapons, where you could interchange buffing of damage from one armor to the next without looking like a clown. An interesting way to implement this would be to have the weaker the armor set, the stronger the skill that you have put on the armor set. This way, the player would be free to play with the trade-offs of damage resistance versus the scaling of the skill. It would also allow you to play with different setups, different choices of armor, and different looks. And that's it for our top 10 wishes and wants for the upcoming DLC for Elden Ring. We are a new channel, so if you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, we would really appreciate the love.